morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody here. Got some of us back and some of us gone again. So it's good to see everybody. And I will say, for those of you who were not here, who were here last Sunday, you'll be happy to know I have kind of as I think about what I need to be working on myself for the week, my motto for this month is be shorter. So, and by the way, you can fill in whatever jokes you want to fill in on that. I'm noting the people that are laughing, and we'll deal with that later. I will say we did talk about trimming this podium down a little bit at one point for no particular reason. Although I think that may be treating the symptom and not the disease. But with that being said, it is today one of the days that I get to preach in the evening too. So I actually am going to be able to break up what I want to talk about into two parts. So you're welcome, and we'll continue on with a thought that I think is important for us, and important enough to spend a couple of sessions talking about it. And this kind of took a little bit of a different direction. If you've ever prepared a lesson or a class and you find yourself going in a direction you really weren't thinking you were going to go with this, and I've been studying and reading out of 1 Timothy. It seems like an appropriate place to look when you're starting your work as an evangelist, because obviously the books of Timothy and Titus were written with the idea of how you were to conduct your work and what you were to think about as an evangelist in the Lord's church. And I found myself thinking about something that took me all the way back to my high school physics class. I was a pretty mediocre student back then in physics, at least. But it's still something that kind of fascinates me, especially as I look back on it. There are some concepts there that the more you understand them, the more you start to see that they apply not only just to the basic ideas of, for example, if I stand up at the top of a hill and push a boulder, what force do I need to apply to get it to roll, and how fast is it, how does it gain speed, and all those other things. There's some applications that go beyond the physical realm and go really into all matters of your life. And the thing that I thought about as I read 1 Timothy was the idea of a word called entropy. Now, a lot of you are thinking, great, we're having another sermon on entropy. I can't believe we're talking about this over and over again. Now, some of you may be thinking, I don't know what entropy is. I have no idea what you're talking about. Some of you may not remember high school physics. You may not have taken high school physics, and you're thinking, what in the world does this idea of entropy, whatever that means, have to do with 1 Timothy? Well, let's make sure that we're all on the same page here. Here's a very clear and easy to understand definition of what entropy means. Entropy is a thermodynamic quantity representing the unavailability of a system's thermal energy for conversion into a mechanical work, often interpreted as the degree of disorder or randomness in the system. You see, we all understand this now. Well, it's an easier version of that, and one that we can probably understand, because we may not think in terms of the technical definitions of what this means, but what we do understand is a more general applications of this idea, which is that the lack of order or predictability, the gradual decline into disorder. That is essentially the second law of thermodynamics for those of you who remember physics, or those of you who have picked it up just in caping. The idea that basically stuff stops working. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. Over time, if you have a system and it is organized in a certain way so that you can get the maximum amount of work out of it, if you let it go, eventually, over time, it's going to degrade its performance, right? I have an engine in my car that is designed when everything is working right, exactly how it is specified to do, that it will get somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 or so horsepower. That's great, but if I sit it in my driveway and I don't do anything at all, over time, that performance is going to degrade, and at some point, it's not going to work at all, right? We all understand those principles. The idea of entropy, the idea of gradual decline from order to disorder, is a concept that every single parent in this house, in this building, understands, because you know what is going to happen by the time that you start. If you want to go to my house, in fact, if you'll see my kitchen, a week ago, if you had seen it, it looked in pretty orderly condition. It's not like that anymore, because I haven't applied the work that is necessary to maintain that semblance of order. That is a general general idea, and it relates to everything that we do in our lives. Whether it's be my lawn that needs to be cut and has all the weeds that are growing up and eventually becomes ragged, whether it's my house that becomes dirty, whether it's my creek that is now littered with garbage because of the flood or the rains or whatever it might be, everything goes towards disorder. What does that have to do with 1 Timothy? Well, doesn't that apply not just to physical things? You know, we can see buildings. Buildings will go into disrepair. How about businesses? What happens if I start a business and I just kind of let it go and I'm not constantly thinking about how to maintain it, how to optimize it, how to grow? What happens? It eventually starts to fall apart, doesn't it? How about our relationships? What happens when I have a relationship that I don't put any energy into, any effort into? That relationship falls apart. What about our marriages? What about the local church? We start to see the importance of this concept. Everything stops working unless I am willing to put the energy and the effort into maintaining it in a certain way. Solomon understood this concept very well. And I think about Solomon a lot. We've been reading the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings, and we think about what he was going through in the state of his kingdom. You know, when we think about, let me back up a little bit. I'm not ready for that yet. When we think about the idea of nothing, you know, Robert Frost wrote, "Nothing gold can stay." We write poetry, we write stories, all around the idea that everything can be great and can be exactly where we want it, but something always happens. That's the story of Camelot. For those of you who know about King Arthur, you know, the idea that this one brief shining moment where everything was wonderful, but human nature and human frailty and the ravages of time and the influences from the outside all degrade that experience over and over again to the idea that nothing stays good. It's all temporary. And that's the book of Ecclesiastes when in verse 20 and 21, Solomon wrote, "So I turned about and gave my heart up to the despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This is also a vanity and a great evil." We talked about that in the class this morning in passing. You know, the idea that what is the point of me putting all this work and effort to something that's just going to fall apart anyway, especially if I'm not there to manage that process. Now, you're probably starting to see a little bit of why this is related to 1 Timothy, aren't you? Because this is a concern that has fit every single leader in the Bible. They all had this philosophy. At least those who were strong, who had a concern for God's work. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, in fact, let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 31, if you will. Deuteronomy chapter 31, let's read. This is Moses' last address to the people, or during his last address. And notice what he says, beginning in verse 24. It says, "When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant, and the Lord said, 'Take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord our God, that it may be there for a witness against you. For I know how rebellious and stubborn you are. Behold, even today, while I am yet alive with you, you have been rebellious against the Lord. How much more after my death? Assemble to me all the elders of your tribe and your officers, that I may speak these words in their ears and call heaven and earth to witness against them. For I know that after my death you will surely act corruptly and turn aside from the way that I have commanded you. And in the days to come evil will befall you, because you will do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger through the work of your hands.'" And we know that's exactly what happened. We see the time of the judges comes up, and over we see this idea there arose up a generation that did not know the Lord. It did what seemed right in his own eyes, because things deteriorate. I think we mentioned the whole idea of that old game we used to play called telephone. And the idea that when I start with one message here, by the time I get to the end of that line, it is almost unrecognizable a lot unless I am absolutely adamant that every person in that chain is focused and listening and doing exactly what that person said. Then I might have a shot at it. But we know that typically that's not how that game works. And so when we think about Paul, let's bring this back to 1 Timothy. What does all this have to do with 1 Timothy? Well, remember Paul's relationship to the church of Ephesus. You know, this is a church that Paul met or associated with and eventually, started on the way back on his second missionary journey. He stopped by there briefly, had quite a bit of success there, had good reception there. They asked him to stay longer, and he said, no, I have to go, but he's going to come back to them. He leaves Aquila and Priscilla there, if you remember. They in turn teach Apollos, and Apollos goes out. And before you know it, this small church is becoming very significant. And when Paul comes back over in Acts chapter 19, he works with them for about 3 years there. And during that time, this church becomes, if not one of, if not the most important churches in all of the world. Because it was here that it became this hub for the gospel. And it became this area by which people were growing and thriving. And all of these regions in Asia really started off with this work in Ephesus. But even then, Paul sees something. And Paul is thinking about something. And in chapter 20, if you remember, as he's on his way back to Jerusalem, he goes down to Miletus on his way back, and he calls the elders of Ephesus and calls them to meet with him 30 miles away. And he gives them a charge and warns them. And he says in verse 28 to 30, he says, "Pay careful attention to yourself, to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in and among you, not sparing the flock. And from among you, your own selves will arise men, speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them." Things were working great in Ephesus. They were growing. They were thriving. And yet there's something in Paul's mind. And he says, you need to be careful. You need to watch it because something is coming. And when we see in 1 Timothy, when we finally get to 1 Timothy, what does he say in verses 1 through 2? Now, the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared. Notice the language he used there. Now, the Spirit expressly says. It specifically says, this isn't a matter of interpretation. This isn't me thinking, well, I got the impression that he thought. No, this is going to happen. At some point in the future, you are going to have these people that are going to come into the Lord's church and are going to divide you up and are going to cause issues with you. And you need to be ready for it. And you wonder how this must have felt for Paul when he's having these discussions. All the time that he's doing this work with the Ephesians and he's building them up, knowing all the while that this is temporary. Knowing all the while that all the work that he has done is going to be undid at some point. And it's, we mentioned Solomon a minute ago, and we think about his rule and his kingdom, and when he was writing Ecclesiastes, and you have to wonder whether that was in his mind too. When he writes the idea that who will do the labor after I have gone, I wonder if he knew something about his son Rehoboam that maybe he didn't express here. Did he see something coming? Did he realize that Israel is as good as it can get right now, and there's only one direction for us to go now, and that's downhill. And after I leave, do you wonder, he was the wisest man in the world. You think he might have seen some of these things coming, seeing some of the underlying idolatry that was rising up even in his own country, and in fact, even in his own life, towards the end of his life. Now, we're not told a lot about how Solomon embraced idolatry or didn't. We know that he did it because of his wives. Now, did he do that half-heartedly and just to tolerate them and to put up with them? Did he launch into it with all his might? I suspect that that's probably not what happened. I suspect that there was if you've ever done anything that you knew you shouldn't be doing, and you're all the time, that voice in your head saying, why are you doing this? Stop doing this. You're not supposed to be doing this, and yet you do it anyway. I suspect Solomon had a lot of that going on. And I suspect that he observed what was happening in his own life and in the life of his kingdom and realizing that this cannot last because we're drifting away from God.